Hi, everyone. We'll just start in a few minutes. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sanoja Bomik. I work at Phenomenal World and the Jane Family Institute, and we're really excited to be hosting this panel today on the topic of resource nationalism and efforts towards decarbonization. And we're really fortunate to be hosting a really excellent group of people to be discussing these urgent issues in a conversation moderated by Alex Yablon. I'll pass it over to Alex in just a moment to give a more full introduction, but just a few housekeeping notes first. The event today will consist of about 45 minutes of discussion, followed by time for questions from the audience. So please stick around for that because we'd love to hear from you. And you can use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions. And in case you haven't heard about Phenomenal World, we're a publication focused on political economy, history, international finance, and many other topics. And you can stay up to date on future events like this, either through our Twitter at Phenomenal World or our newsletter, our weekly newsletter, PW Sources, which is a roundup of readings from across the social sciences sent out each Saturday morning. So that is it for me, and I'll pass it over to Alex.
Thank you so much, Sanoja. Hi, my name is Alex Yablon. I'm a fellow at the Jane Family Institute and a writer on economic and policy topics. So we're here today to talk about resource nationalism and decarbonization in Latin America. So as the global push to decarbonize accelerates, however haltingly, the pressure is mounting in countries that produce an outsized share of the commodities essential to that transformation. In Latin America, the growing demand for metals like lithium and copper has simultaneously increased the ambition of a new generation of left-wing political leaders eager to assert sovereignty over natural resources, while dividing those same politicians' own coalitions with debates over how to balance economic development with local environmental protection. For instance, just last week, Chile's world-leading copper industry was rocked by a strike after left-wing President Gabriel Boric announced he was shuttering a state-owned smelter over emissions concerns. Resource nationalism has also introduced geopolitical quandaries. It's made Latin America a site of competition between China and the United States, which has hemmed in the agency of local political leaders. For instance, in Mexico, President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador has had to walk back a bold declaration that he was nationalizing the country's lithium deposits after running into conflicts with Chinese mining firms who already secured lithium concessions. So to help us understand the dynamics of resource nationalism and decarbonization in Latin America, we're joined by Thea Riofrancos, Martin Obaya, and Miguel Angel Marmolejo Cervantes. Thea Riofrancos is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, an Associate Professor of Political Science at Providence College, and the author of Resource Radicals, From Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, from Duke University Press, and is currently writing Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. Martin Obaya is a researcher at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council and the director of the Centro de Investigaciones para la Transformación at the Economics and Business School of the National University of San Martin. His research is focused on the lithium industry in the lithium triangle of South America. Miguel Angel Marmolejo Cervantes is a research professor at the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León, whose research and practice focuses on the law and economics of energy and mining. He's an advisor at the National Hydrocarbon Commission in Mexico and for the Ministry of Energy. So to kick things off, resource nationalism in Latin America is nothing new. There's a long history of state involvement in mining and energy. But what's different about this wave that is driven by decarbonization to the very different global process? This is open to any of you who'd like to address this one.
If I may?
Go for it.
Well, I guess it's the merit, because as a general concept, it is because of the energy transition. For instance, clean energy, clean mobility through electric vehicles and long-term energy storage, to me, are key components to achieve it. But as you said, our president here in Mexico, it could be then like a new wave, but old practices, and we should figure out how to overcome that. Because at the end of the day now, the proposal is more state, less market, with no checks and balances. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts, and I'm gonna, if it's okay, Alex, I'm gonna broaden this question a little bit beyond decarbonization to start with. And Miguel might want to jump back in, or Martin can follow up. But I just want to talk about what's in general different about resource nationalism, so-called, in the present moment versus the classic moment of the early 20th through mid 20th century. So whether we talk about Cardenas and oil in Mexico, or we look at Allende and copper in Chile, like there are these classic nationalizations that really did expropriate resources. They took assets out of the hands of capitalists. They forced, in some cases, foreign capitalists to actually leave the country, right? There was capital flight. There was a real transfer of assets from the private to the public sector. There was sometimes deep reorganizations of the sector to serve different goals than profit accumulation, right? So that's a radical, in today's terms, I would call that a classic, but also like a radical form of resource nationalism. In the present, what we've seen, and we can, again, broaden it beyond decarbonization, because some of what I'm saying comes from the fossil fuel sector in the global south. Like what we've seen is a number of things. First of all, less of the classic form of expropriation, more things like forced renegotiation of contract, majority stakes for the state, joint ventures, right? So a more collaborative, even if it's done from a position of strength or in a muscular way, it's ultimately more collaborative with foreign or multinational capital. And it doesn't generally exclude, private ownership entirely. It just puts the state in more of a driver's seat. In some cases, and we'll talk about this more later, we're talking about sectors where there isn't much private capital at all yet, new sectors, right? So the state gets in at the ground floor, but despite the rhetoric, I think if you look at the details, the idea is to attract also private investment, right? So we can talk about that more later, but these are just some broad differences. we also see, I think, that like state-owned firms and resource sectors, mining or fossil fuels, are kind of more isomorphic with multinationals. Like they look more similar. The governance structures are more similar. We see less of that difference. So that again is another way in which maybe nationalization is less radical than it was in the past. And I'm not saying this to be pessimistic, like we couldn't do more radical, but that's just like the empirical trend. And then just to not speak too much, I'll just add like one other piece here. Maybe to put it in more positive terms, rather than just saying it's less radical, I also think there's some interesting substantive differences right now. And the lithium sector is very key here. And my colleagues will speak to it more, that I think there are these different roles being envisioned for a state firm, not always exploration and ownership, but things like, R&D, upgrading, value chain coordination, right? Sort of putting the state in this key coordinating role along with existing or new private investment to change the direction of the sector and orient it towards something, whether it's increasing the state take, whether it's or the societal take, whether it's increasing value added, whether it's spurring the energy transition, whatever the goal is, there's a state role in coordination. And that's a little bit different than the, digging in the ground kind of form of the state role in a resource sector. But I threw a lot on the table, so I'll pause there. But I think those are some broad strokes differences that include also the prior pink tide, which we can get to, and the older, form of classic expropriation.
It's interesting. I mean, along the lines, as following Thea, I think we should try to discuss a little bit the concept of nationalism, because I think it's a little bit vague, maybe. So when you go to the field and try to analyze what's happening in the region, we need some nuances, So in general, I mean, we think of as nationalism as greater involvement of the state. But as Thea said, the state can intervene in many different ways. So if you analyze the case of lithium, what you see in the region is that you have many different strategies. So in South America, you have on the one extreme, you have like more classical example of nationalization, which is Bolivia. They own the resource. They have a public firm has the monopoly of the exploitation. On the other extreme, you have Argentina, which is more market-led. And the only push towards nationalization is, okay, the public oil company said they wanted to step into the lithium business. A more intermediate experience is that of Chile, and we'll see what will happen. What happen in the future, we can discuss about that. But my feeling is that the intention of Chile to build a lithium public oil company, is more like creating a company that can create a joint venture with a private firm, so to have more control of the resource. But the starting point is we don't have the capabilities to do it by ourselves. But the other thing about what's new about this new wave, this decarbonization-induced resource super cycle, I think this provides states with new narratives. That's an important point, because here in Argentina, what you hear, I mean, and you have different narratives. You hear, for example, we are now protagonists of the energy transition as suppliers of raw materials. So we have to do it very quickly, as quickly as we can, because this window opportunity will close very in the near future. So we have to do it now. So then you have, well, the energy transition is unfair because benefits countries from the north. So we should have more strategic control of the resource. That's another narrative. And then you have, this is not enough. If we have lithium, we have to industrialize it. We should produce batteries. That's another narrative. So you have nationalization within the frame of the energy transition. I think you have new narratives. However, and this is my last point here, I wonder, as Miguel Angel said before, I wonder if this is not all wine in new bottles, because in the end, what we are discussing is what is the role of natural resources in the strategy of economic development of our countries. Now, in the context of the energy transition, but we've heard this discussion, the essence of this discussion for the last 70 years, at least.
Yeah, I guess, building on that, like, can you talk about, what has traditionally been the kind of the promise and peril of a nationalized resource sector as a engine of national economic and social development? I'll leave it there.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand. I understand the question. So what's the parallel?
Just if you could just go into more detail about, what is that old wine that's being put in new bottles? What have traditionally been the pitfalls of resource nationalism as the kind of engine of national economic development? Where has it made good on its promise and where has it fallen short?
In particular, when I say old wine, I mean the role of national resources in the strategy of economic development.
Right.
Then you have what's the role of the state in that particular strategy, and there you have, I would say, like some common patterns in the region. You can identify so-called waves of nationalization and privatization, and then particular experiences. Thea mentioned, or you, as I think in your introduction, the case of Codelco, for example, in copper. It's a national champion. It's a good experience overall of a state-owned company producing natural resource and contributing to the development, at least in macroeconomic terms, providing foreign resources to a country. In the case of Argentina, I think it's more the experience is more modest. We have the case of the oil company, which contributed to the development of oil resources in the past, but then was privatized and then was nationalized again and contributed to the development of non-conventional sources. So I think that the experience is mixed and depends on each country. I think maybe in Mexico you have a different experience. I don't know what your opinion is, Miguel Angel, about this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Martin and Alex. Basically, all practices, it's this, idea or concept that the state as an entity should be present all the time, and also all practices to me mean like the way to rule natural resources. And probably it could be this word that we don't want to mention a lot, but we will have to face it, extractivism. And to me, extractivism it could be then an evolving line, you know what I mean? So this is just an evolved concept now at present time. But following more the idea of Thea, to me, and we were characterizing that stuff in our article with Rafael Garduño that we wrote about it, lithium, and it's about hard or soft, Are we talking about hard nationalism or soft nationalism? Hard to me is just the state. Soft to us as well is, half and half, We got a mixed economy. You gotta, let the private investors to play around and to develop their expertise, especially on technology. But I don't wanna, anticipate on that. I would say that all practices mean extractivism. And it could be a new wave, but it could be a new, concept evolved by saying all practices.
Yeah, I think just to add a little bit, thanks, Miguel. I love that term, and I'm going to read that paper now, hard at first soft. I think it captures a lot of what I was saying, and I'm curious to read it. But so just to add only a little bit more, I think that, as maybe Martin was the first to introduce, like there's different dimensions on which we can evaluate success and failure. And I'm glad that Miguel said the term extractivism, which is a contested term, and it's its own critique of state-led resource development, which we'll come to in a moment. So there's an environmental and social and indigenous justice critique of any type of resource development, whether state, public or private. And we can come to that. But just to stay within the kind of macroeconomic, I think that we can think about, how much has it contributed to the overall economic revenues of the state? And then what have those revenues been reinvested in? Has it contributed to, developmental indicators through reinvestment in social and public service? So there's that kind of direction. We can talk about job growth, and that sort of thing. We can also talk a little more complexly about, diversification and upgrading, right? Has state ownership contributed to these? And I think on all fronts, the record is mixed, which doesn't at all just point to like the errors of state ownership, but also to the constraints of the global economic order, right? I think that we need to be realistic about the position of dependency, the long legacy of that, and how that constrains state action when there's a fundamental dependency on foreign capital. But with that huge caveat, I think just to evaluate the most recent waves of so-called, nationalizations that weren't really, hard nationalizations at all during the pink tide, I think we do see on the positive side of the ledger, we see, a big boon to state finances, right? Through the forced renegotiation of contracts and in some cases majority stakes and joint ventures. And you have a tremendous growth in the coffers of the state. In many cases, those were invested in ways that met human needs, putting aside corruption or use of funds in not perfect ways. But overall, there was a lifting out of poverty, and a lot of that had to do with resource rents, right? And so that's a success in my view. Where there was failure or lack of success or pitfalls is, we have limited diversification, we have limited value added, we have many, petro states that don't have refineries, right? So you're not even value adding in the same kind of supply chain, let alone diversifying to more economic sectors. And then you have, the fundamental continued dependency, even if less dependency on immediate foreign capital, you still have dependency on the overall market structure. So the volatility of these commodity markets affects that fiscal basis of the state in a very deep way. So the closer you tie the fiscal basis to volatile markets, the more you're, at a loss when there's a commodity bust, and then you implement austerity, right? So blah, blah, blah. We could go down the line, but I think, to sort it out, we kind of measure all these different dimensions because they can go in different kind of directions.
Yeah, if I can say something, it is absolutely, agree, Tia. For instance, Pemex or Pemex and CFE are sources from nationalism policies, and now lithium mex. So there's been success for national development, but crisis in governance, let's say corruption, international trading, and debt burden, compel governments absolutely to find and coexist with market solutions. And exactly, we are in a turning point right now, especially on lithium mex. It's going to be a state company. It is not, incorporated so far. They got 90 days because President Lopez Obrador amended this law, and it was approved in the Congress. It is still going on. It's on the way, but we really don't know for sure if this is the path that we should follow, especially in a modern economy.
Yeah, I guess, Thea, you've written a lot, obviously quite extensively about conflicts between the old school of resource nationalists who want to kind of engage in what Miguel described as like hard extractivist resource nationalism, and then a newer generation of activists who are aligned with often with the indigenous rights movement, who want to limit extractivism. And in the context of say oil, these seem like a pretty clearly demarcated camps. But I wonder, if in the context of lithium and a transition away from oil, where certainly in the United States we've seen this the kind of there's a division between the strategies of people who back a kind of a Green New Deal and a kind of a new industrial policy based around decarbonization, and then old school environmentalists who are much more concerned with the fact that even if you're going to have a decarbonized electrified economy, that's still going to depend on some pretty locally environmentally destructive practices, and particularly in the case of lithium. So I'm curious if those kind of battle lines remain drawn in similar ways within these countries in Latin America, or if it is sort of scrambled them in some ways. Yeah, I guess if you want to address that first.
I'll start, but I think that this could apply potentially in all cases to different degrees. So I'm curious what Miguel and Martin think. But again, I'm going to broaden it first beyond the energy transition and decarbonization sectors and look more broadly at this tension. So absolutely right, like during the pink tide, Ecuador was an extreme case, but this resonated across the region where we had tensions between environmentalists and indigenous movements on the one hand, and on the other hand, the pink tide governments that kind of pinned their economic and political kind of mandate in many ways in expanding the state role in extractive sectors, and in many cases expanding extraction in territorial terms, right? And so that generated conflicts in Ecuador. Those conflicts were maybe the highest pitch, but they existed elsewhere. So I do think that, and I sometimes I'm accused of being an optimist, so maybe I'm being slightly optimistic here, but I think there's been a bit of a mutual learning process, and I'm drawing on like recent events in Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, where I see, both sides. In some cases, the camps are less clearly defined, but anyway, people on sort of both sides of this debate are kind of, there's some alignment happening. On the one hand, I think that very militant anti-extractive activists and indigenous activists that resist at the point of extraction are still doing that. But I think also there has been learning at how dangerous it is to have the right wing in power, and how much like left fragmentation like really leads to even higher levels of, let's say, criminalization of anti-extractive protesters. Like it's worse to be under a right-wing government, even if the left-wing governments also did not behave well towards those protesters. Like being under Lasso or Bolsonaro is worse, right? And so I think that there's a sense of like, there's a shared desire to have the left in power, even if those tensions exist. And then I think on the resource nationalist side, I've seen, and Mexico might be distinct, and so I'm really curious what Miguel says here, but I've definitely seen in Chile, even in some of the failed campaigns like Arauz in Ecuador, definitely with the current new government in Colombia, much more acknowledgement of climate crisis, of environmental concerns, of indigenous rights, of pluriculturalism. And so I think that from both ends, they're like reaching each other a bit. And there's been this iterative process of learning. And the last thing I'll say now to actually go to your question of like, is it different in like lithium or energy transition sectors? Just to underscore something that Martin said earlier, I do think that there are new narratives from the state, as he put it, and these are good and bad from the environmental perspective. On the one hand, a lot of these states are emphasizing like not so much the extractive end, but more the value added, the upgrading, the innovation. And some of those roles have less immediate environmental harm, right? And so you see the state inserting itself at a part of the supply chain that might generate less conflict with frontline communities, right? That's a more positive way. But the more negative way to take that, again, on Martin's point, is that the state, just like corporate mining corporations, is equipped with a narrative that like, we need to mine this lithium to fight climate change, no matter what the resistance is. So they're equipped with a powerful, not just developmentalist, but sort of climate action narrative to counter anti-mining protest with. So I think it's between that balance that we'll kind of see where the forces lie.
Yes, I agree. I agree with Thea. In the case of Argentina, which is for obvious reasons the case I know better, I can see the category left-right is very useful to explain the position in regards to environment and indigenous rights. Obviously, yes, there are progressive groups which are relatively small, which are sensitive to these topics. But in my view, in general, there is a political consensus that we have to, that lithium and resources in general, mining in general, is strategic industry, and we have to go for it. That's the political consensus. Then you can find maybe there are some nuances. So if you are more left-oriented, the narrative is more, as Thea said, more related to adding value or giving a more strategic role to the scientific community, and trying to create capabilities related to the resource. And if you are more like right, center-right, or you have more center-right orientation, you are more like, okay, let's go for it, let's exploit it quickly. But in terms of the environment, and you can see right now, the debate within the government, which supposedly is like a left-oriented government, you have like two different groups, more, and the discussion is more within the government than with the opposition. So one group is more sensitive to environmental issues, and the other group is more like, okay, we have, and I try to justify the position of the other part of the government, is that the country has the same GDP per capita as 1974. So in political terms, the urgency is how to get revenues and foreign resource, I mean, dollars from the export of resources. So this is why I think there is a broad consensus around the idea resources have to be exploited. Then we'll discuss the details, but this is the priority.
Well, exactly, Martin. In the case of Mexico, Tia, we are trying to reach, this meeting point that you are asking for. And this meeting point is to try to balance the social and environmental justice. For instance, we are part of the ILO 169 treaty. It's applicable in Mexico, and it was incorporated into the recent mining law amendments. And for instance, the Mexican state has the duty to, protect environmental and the rights of the native indigenous people, indigenous community, and Afro-Mexican communities. So we are, taking that part. Of course, it's not easy. I mean, not because you put it in the law, it means that it's gonna become true. You know what I mean? I mean, we need to keep pushing on that, and in order to achieve this social and environmental justice.
It is interesting, the case of Bolivia, because in Bolivia, during the presidency of Evo Morales, many environmental groups left the government, disappointed with the government of Morales, because they felt that the government went beyond what they expected in terms of the exploitation of national resources. So it is a delicate balance for people in government, because when you are in government, you have to deal with the urgency of the economy, which in terms of perception is more urgent than the urgencies of the environment. No, so I think that's important to understand why some people change when they get into the government and have government responsibilities.
Well, I have a theory, this reality test, and when they, take position, the reality test overcome everything. I mean, they feel overwhelmed, and they have to produce results at the end of the day, to their constituency, but also to the campaign promises.
Yeah, but in some cases, the promises are include environmental promises. So they have an environmental agenda. So in some cases, the government doesn't have any, it doesn't have interest in environment, so it's not a surprise. But in other cases, when you have a very environment-oriented agenda and political
green
platform,
agenda. Yeah.
It's a green agenda. In those cases, what you see in reality is that it's very difficult to maintain the promises. So it's interesting to analyze that.
I'm gonna just, I know we're going so back and forth in this question. That was all that.
That was great.
I think that absolutely, as both of you just said, these play out as tensions within ministries, like as tensions between colleagues, between bureaucrats, right? And so But I'm going to just shift us back to a moment to the civil society, and then we can maybe, move on unless folks have more to say. That, in addition to this intra-state, intra-cabinet stuff, what I've seen, again, more positively, maybe optimistically, or in terms of this intra-left conflict, is that groups in civil society have been thinking in terms of the role of public control, maybe something a little different than outright state control, right? Miguel pointed this out earlier, like there's maybe even something broader than state ownership, which is public ownership. And meaning that public ownership can take various forms. There can be community ownership, there can be worker ownership, there can be joint governance, or, whatever. And so if we think in terms of like a commons that's in the public, then I think that it's interesting that activists in Chile and elsewhere in the region are saying, like, we don't want to per se repeat Codelco, because Codelco created all these environmental harms, right? But we do think that we need to expand the role of the public, broadly construed, in order to meet our environmental goals. But then, of course, the question becomes that even if you arrive with that agenda to power, like, will that create, dissensus within the state? But I think that it's an interesting twist. I think that anti-extractivism in the past, in my view, just observer, was more anti-statist. And now there is a more thinking through, like, what might new hybrid forms of ownership that include the public, include civil society, include workers and communities look like that can ensure more of the environmental agenda is actually implemented.
Well, we can put it in these terms: more participative governance structures of natural resources. Yeah, I can see that as well.
Are happening in that realm. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with that. Even though, I can't see that in the case of Argentina, but I can see that all over the world. I mean, that's on the agenda, at least.
But you know what? At the end of the day, it's also, the power of the activism, because you can call it civil society, but I can also call you activism, and there's activism in corporations. There are also activism in academia, like we're doing this, exercise, and there's also activism in government. So we need to push forward that.
So it's something that I'm really struck by, the sort of the global bout of commodity shocks has driven a lot of large firms to more vertically integrate their natural resource supply chains. And, this is particularly true in the case of lithium. Tesla is taking, really extraordinary measures to secure vast reserves of these minerals. And that means that, these large corporate a new generation of large corporate actors are going to have, interests in the region and in these natural resources that are, at the heart of these national economic development strategies. And I'm curious how these national governments plan on, balancing their desire to get foreign investment and expertise with, the obviously very troubled history of multinational and particularly like American corporate conduct in the region.
Here, I think, again, the experiences are different within the lithium triangle. I mean, in Argentina, I see no conflict because the market is open to foreign firms, and firms operating in downstream segments, they, in some cases, are creating joint venture with mining companies. In other cases, they feel that they firm deal agreements, to supply agreements. So there are different strategies. And the public companies, which is YPF, which is the public oil company, if it in the future enters into the market, will be like it will operate like private players. I mean, will have no privileges. In the case of Chile, I think there shouldn't be any conflict. I mean, if the government creates this public lithium firm, as far as I know, the idea is to create a joint venture. So it should work in association with private firms. And the two contracts which are enforced now with SQM and Albemarle will remain in force. So I don't think that there will be a conflict there. Maybe the case of Bolivia is different because the normative framework is different. So that's the overall view of the region in my view.
Well, quite the opposite in Mexico. And I'm talking about in terms of the recent, amendments of the mining law. But I want to add something. I mean, it's not only Tesla, also the Chinese company are working vertically, and the main demand right now is in China. But in the case of North America, trade zone, it represents to us an opportunity to Canada, Mexico, and the US for development, especially because in the US, lithium and supply chains, global supply chains, have been considered as a matter of national and defense policy. In terms of the USMCA, to us, it could represent, an opportunity. But the law, I can tell you about the law, this recent amended law. It is also under the subject of the Mexican Supreme Court. It has been challenged because it contradicts basically what the Mexican constitutional states and also what the international trading system signed by the Mexican authorities, also states. So it is not an easy question to be answered, but I can tell you that it's something that it's challenged so far.
Yeah, I want to, I don't know why this keeps being my role here, but I'm going to broaden a little bit away from just
I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just, somehow this is my shtick today. But first of all, those were very interesting answers that I think reveal a lot about cross-national variation here, right? For sure. But I want to go a little more broadly to what are the implications for state ownership, to just generally, what are the implications for the position in the global market for this rush to secure resources, right? So if you're in the global south, if you're Argentina or Chile primarily, you are major producers already of lithium. I'm not, it's not huge compared to oil sectors or copper, but it's in the list of lithium producers, they are, like in the top 4, right? And so the question is what does it mean to have Tesla, VW, Chinese BYD, whatever it is, what does it mean to have this new rush of different forms of investment, which take 2 forms now, right? On the one hand, it's these long-term offtake agreements, meaning that Tesla wants to make sure that for the next 10 years, it has a lithium supply. So it contracts directly with a lithium firm to get the supply from a specific mine. And then the second is a little more unusual, or in contemporary terms, but it's almost a back to the future or something, back to the early 20th century, where you have more direct vertical integration, right? So Tesla might be a joint owner of a mine in a company. So, on just strictly economic terms, this could be good because you have more investment flowing in, taking these different forms, and you have more buyers for the same stuff. And so you have no problem with demand and the prices look great, right? So that's the positive end. I think though there's another way, maybe getting more into the geopolitics or the political economy, that this gets a little more complex because, right now these global South producers, especially Chile, Bolivia, and maybe this will also apply to Mexico and Argentina, I'm less sure, are very interested about moving up the value chain. But let's just take Chile, which is the best example because it's already an established producer and it's establishing a state-owned company. It's tech checks all the boxes. So Chile is an existing producer. It wants to maintain its market position. It wants to move up the value chain, 2 things at once, right? And those have different policies. And now you're looking and you're seeing the US, the EU declare lithium a strategic critical mineral. They're incentivizing lithium production within the EU and US. That means you are going to lose market share at some point. Maybe it's 5 years, 10 years down the line, but you have new competition on the raw materials end. Not only that, these US, EU, these global North states are also doing the same developmentalist. They want to move up the value chain. And so they're fighting for investment in many cases from Korea, Japan, China, to build these battery companies. So kind of on both ends, you're being squeezed. Like the market's growing, that's good. The prices are high, that's good. But in terms of like setting up the supply chain and maintaining market share, now all of a sudden you have new forms of competition from countries that are very positioned in terms of their relationships with multinational firms that maybe even sometimes headquartered there. So I'll just say that, like, I don't know, it's uncertain, but it is very interesting, I think, what happens in a decade from now, whether we still have Chile and Argentina, number 2 and 3 on the list, or whether they're being bumped down by, who knows, Portugal and Mexico. I mean, like the whole list of producers is changing, and that has a lot to do with the securitization of lithium, of like the global North states wanting to secure it, Tesla wanting to secure it, this very supply chain oriented strategy by both governments and firms.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, the last few years, and I would say in the last few weeks, I mean, as I think you mentioned, the Mineral Security Partnership that US signed with Canada, Australia, the UK, Germany, I mean, was signed in Toronto, I think, a few weeks ago. And the idea is that of, I think that of the, I mean, usually is referred to as friendshoring. So the idea of, I mean, this competition with China, okay, I'm not sure we'll meet all the lithium requirements or critical materials requirements with domestic production. So let's try at least to create an association with all the countries with whom we share values and our friends against China. So I think that's the correct framework to analyze the lithium question in Latin America, for sure. My impression is that maybe with the exception of the US, maybe, I don't think we'll find, at least in the next 10 years, much lithium in other parts of the world, at least at competitive prices. I mean, in the case of Europe, you have Portugal and you have alternative lithium resources, but I'm not sure they will be. I mean, technologies have to be developed. I am sorry to say that I think this is the same case with Mexico. I don't think Mexico will be able to produce lithium compounds or lithium concentrate in the next 10 years, because I mean, you have the resources. I mean, you have clay resources. Technology has to be developed. At the beginning, will be the production cost will be much higher than the rest, South America at least. So I think that I agree with you, Thea, that this is the context, but still South America has still some advantage on the upstream sector. So the case of Argentina in regards to the competition between the US, EU, and China, I think it's is the most interesting field because it's the most open country. So last month we had in Catamarca the Lithium Congress, and it was like they expected 200 people, and it was like 800 with people from all over the world, because it's the only country with good lithium resources in which you can invest. Because Chile is practically close to investment, Bolivia is close to investment. So it is very interesting what we'll have in the next few years in terms of competition, geopolitical competition.
Exactly. I mean, I absolutely agree with Martin. I mean, lithium is present in pegmatites, brine, oil wells, geothermal, field clays, and even in the oceans. And to me, well, it is my understanding that it's economically feasibly choosing brines and pegmatites. And unfortunately, Mexico has lithium on clays and clay deposits. So it seems to me that geology won't be on our side for the time being, but that's just on the upstream side. If we talk about midstream and downstream, we are in a strategic position, and Chinese companies can Mexicanize, their investment and get access to the North American free trade market. So if I were the president, the best tactic is to remain neutral, because we need to play with the US, of course, we are basically integrated in terms of the supply chains, global supply chains, but also we don't want to be more dependent on the US economy. So we need to open our economy and to, fight back in a positive way, of the word, and try to, set up a joint venture with the Chinese market, because at the end of the day, the demand is on China, not even in Europe, not even in the US or Canada. And I was very, concerned about this. Well, I was putting too much attention of this, meeting with the president of Chile and Trudeau in Canada. And you know what? They got also a free trade agreement, same as Mexico. They got 25 years and they got a free trade agreement as well. But the point here is that, are we gonna follow this, free market vision? What about the environmental issue again? What about the social? What about the social benefits that should permeate to the people? Because one of the main critics right now is that, okay, you got these major free trade agreements, but it doesn't mean that you're gonna be, the beneficiary of that trading. And if you're not the beneficiary, then you will have, political turmoil. And we've seen that in Chile, and not that much in Mexico, but tensions are high in Mexico in terms of the US-Mexican relationship. I mean, you will not see President Lopez Obrador get along as, Trudeau and Gabriel, you know what I mean? So, and that matters, because that is the way the countries, set up a minimum dialogue on critical issues. I don't know, what do you think, Thea?
Well, I want to say something that has to do a bit with China, which now Miguel has already brought up a couple of times, maybe Martin, and I know Alex wanted to ask about, but yeah. Alex, do you want to, because I think what I'm going to say is going to take us there anyway. So do you want to move to China?
Yeah, I would just, certainly I think there, maybe a decade ago, there was some hope that decarbonization might foster greater global cooperation. It now seems clear that this is a domain of global geopolitical competition, particularly between the United States and China, and that these two superpowers that are competing for primacy over these supplies, and then also over the supply chains. How Miguel, you kind of addressed this a bit, but how are the various like lithium producing countries in Latin America trying to balance these geopolitical these geopolitical dynamics? How are they situating themselves between China and the United States, not to mention the rest of the global market?
Yeah, I think that so what I was thinking to say, and I think it's such a good question, and again, I'll keep it a little bit broad for now, but, if you had asked me a couple of years ago, do you see decoupling of supply chains along geopolitical lines, as a possibility? I would have said, a lot of people I interview in the government and corporations either want that or are worried about it, but it's just so hard to imagine, how would you take apart these very intricate, sprawling supply chains, and where would you decide where China begins and the US ends, that sort of thing. But, fast forward to the present, we have decoupled a major economy from a lot of the global trade and financial systems, Russia, through sanctions, right? And so, not to say that Russia doesn't have any economic relations, but there's been a reduction in economic relations between the so-called West and Russia, obviously, right? So I think we're seeing in real time how decoupling could work. And then on the other hand, related to China, US Congress passed the forced labor, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, whatever it's called. So, to basically say that any supply chains that run through potentially forced labor, in China, need to, you have to clean up your act, and there's going to be monitoring, and we're still seeing how it will actually work out in practice. But the point is just with those two touchstones, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the economic fallout and sanctions on the one hand, and on the other hand, US Congress in a rare moment of bipartisanship, doing something to limit, how goods that come through China are entering the US, that makes it seem more possible to me that there's a future, a near or medium term future, in which countries need to pick sides. So the flip side of ally shoring or friend shoring, like Martin said, like, are we going to have situations in which, you know, a state-owned lithium company that has a deal with CATL or BYD, these major Chinese battery makers, is like cut off from the US because it violates the Forced Labor Act? I mean, I don't know, but now these are like, I think, real live questions that have a little more to them than just like the pipe dreams of like autarky, which I never like fully believed in.
Yeah, as Miguel said before, in Argentina, the governments, I should say, follow the same strategy of neutrality. They have tried. I don't know for how long they will be able to because as Thea says, well, probably at some point they will have to pick side. But so far they have tried to take advantage of neutrality. They have done it with China, they have done it with the US, and even with Russia. And also, I should say that in terms of investment, even though the US has been or was the pioneer lithium production in Argentina and in the region in general, in the last few years, China has adopted a more effective strategy, and they control a few sellers now in Argentina. So in the future, we'll see that in practical terms, most lithium production in the country might be controlled by Chinese firms.
Yeah, interesting that Thea is, coming up with this idea of friend-shoring or aligned shoring. I would say that in the case of Mexico, it's near-shoring, and to decoupling the global supply chain is not as easy as we might think. It's not something that you can do it overnight. But the point here is that we will have to figure out how to handle it, because it's on the verge of a conflict. Let me tell you something. Chinese companies, were granted last administration by a concession for 30 years of lithium exploitation. So the question here is, how are we going to do that? Because the US, our main trading partner is asking us to say, hey, all lithium is coming up to here. You know what I mean? So we are on that point, as Martin said, we are on the verge of a conflict. But at the end of the day, the best strategy available to us as a Latin American country is to remain neutral. Because otherwise, if you pick one position so far, then your community will suffer the consequences.
It will be interesting to see what happened with Mexico, because there is you said, I mean, there's a big difference between Mexico and the rest of South America, is that Mexico is already integrated into the automotive production, North America production network. So I assume that North American producers of cells and vehicles count on lithium, Mexican lithium. So that balance will be like very delicate, because if you have, this critical mineral just across the border, I assume, and it's your strategic partner, it will be difficult to maintain this neutrality. It's a delicate balance, I think.
Of course. I mean, and let me add you a different, comment. All factories that are located in Mexico, integrated to a global automotive chain, all manufactured vehicles are export to the US. That's the main market. So there's not much, space for maneuvering this. But at the end of the day, we must respect our trading treaties. I don't know if you heard this before, but the Mexican economy is one of the most open, trading economies around the world. So basically, you can play with each country in the world, main country in the world, in terms of the trading. So I know that politically it's not easy to handle it, but economically, we must have a strategy. And I believe that the strategy, set by President López Obrador to be neutral at as much as possible, it could work for the meantime.
So I think it's time to move on to questions from the audience. We have a couple in the Q&A right now. If anyone watching wants to get theirs in, now would be a great time to do so. So I'll start out with one from Gabriel Goffman, who worked for solar developers in Mexico, and he wanted to know if there's been effort to foster domestic demand for these industries. Are these countries thinking about creating, lots of domestic consumption of these resources as means of developing their supply chains and climbing the value chain?
Well, I know, yeah. Go ahead, Martin. Go ahead, please.
No, I think it's a crucial point, because our discussion, when I said before about this narrative about we have the lithium, so we have to develop the battery, usually is very supply focused. And always my discussion with this strategy is it is organized at global level. The industry tend to organize around regions. So they go where consumers are. So you have a large market supported by state government policies. So you have cell producers, you have battery producers, or that will be in the US, that will be in the EU in the future. And that has been the case of China. So if you want to develop batteries or solar panels, for example, as this person said, you have to think about the demand side. So if you don't have an electric vehicle market, it will be very difficult to have a battery industry, because it doesn't make any sense to produce batteries in Argentina or Chile and export them to Europe or China. Batteries are the logistics of the battery international trade is very complicated, it's very expensive, it's dangerous, you have to pay for it's very, very expensive and difficult to do. So I think it's a crucial question. So I always say, well, if you want to have a battery industry, you first create a renewable energy industry, demand, and an electric vehicle market. Then you think about the battery production.
What I can say to Gabriel is that we need to develop infrastructure. And infrastructure, it's all about, you want to drive an electric vehicle in Mexico. First things first, we need infrastructure. And in order to, boost the infrastructure, we need to overcome this regulatory impasse or standoff that we are living in Mexico. Because, and again, this pendulum has swung very hardly to private sector in my country.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit, and I think Martin makes a good point, and the question asker makes a good point in thinking about how to connect resources, supply chains, and consumer markets, right? And this is kind of like a complicated checkerboard, but in Chile, you do have the advantage, in one sense of having the renewable kind of energy market that Martin is talking about, right? Like Chile is sort of known in Latin America for an ever expanding portion of the electricity matrix is supplied by wind and solar. It has really, enviable assets on those fronts, given geography, et cetera. And so, so we have a lot of, and then depending how you define clean energy, of course, hydro projects have been very controversial in Chile, a lot of resistance to them, but that provides another chunk. And so overall, you have like a lower emissions energy mix in Chile. And so you have the potential end use markets. Not only that, and this gets back to the narratives question, but on the corporate side, and the state too, corporations and government in Chile like to tout oh, we're going to have green mining because the mining runs on solar, and whether or not that makes mining green, I'll put that aside. I think that's a form of greenwashing, but I think it is interesting that they're using it on a reputational brand front to attract mining investment, to say our mining is lower emissions because it runs on solar. It doesn't all, but they say that. So okay, so that's some connections, but I still think, just to underscore what Martin said, you have to fill in the rest of the dots. Just because there's a lot of relative in Latin America terms, a lot of solar and wind. That means there's more battery applications in for storage, for grid storage in Chile than there might be in a country that gets all of its energy from coal or oil or whatever. But then producing that domestically still involves filling in each of the nodes on the supply chain, which Chile does not have now. But in theory, there is more of a market for example, battery storage or solar panels or whatever green technology product in a place with a larger renewable energy portion.
Well, here in Mexico, we are, strengthening this idea or concept of pro-consumer. It's the one that can produce and consume their own energy. Mm-hmm. But in order to do so, we need a stable regulatory framework.
Yeah, the creation of market, that's interesting because I think you both mentioned things related to this. I mean, the creation of market, it's not only people consuming, but it's also rules. I mean, regulatory framework, it's infrastructure, is stability, and is, having the purchasing capacity. So it's very complex. And you see that in Europe as well. I mean, it's not only that, okay, you produce vehicles and you have people with money. There's a problem with infrastructure and rules and all problems related to the creation of new markets.
The next question comes from Kendra Jones, and how did the speakers see the role of basically corruption and criminal organizations in the region fitting into future governance strategies? Obviously, this has been a challenge in some of the countries we're talking about.
I think in Argentina, in general, I don't know if there are some specific cases, but in general, it's not one of the main problems with exploitation of national resources or nationalism and the governance of national resources. This is, for example, however, this has been the case of other critical minerals in the battery value chain. For example, that has been the case of cobalt. The main producer of cobalt is the Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. So in those cases, what has happened is that, for example, the European Union or United Nations, USD, they created like protocols, standards for trying to mitigate or avoid these problems with human rights. And so firms are supposed to follow those rules. We don't have that in the case of lithium. However, I must say that the EU is now drafting a new directive on batteries that might include some due diligence rules that might involve the question of human rights and environmental sustainability. So even though specifically the question of funding armed groups is not a problem in South America, there are many other problems related to human rights in general, relations with indigenous communities.
Yeah, I'm going to flip the question a little bit, because I think that at least in Chile, probably less relevant in Mexico, though I'm curious what Miguel says, but in Chile, one of the impetuses in the first place for nationalization, which is a longstanding demand of the lithium sector, for several years now, there have been groups, union groups, left-wing parties pushing for nationalization. They just finally now have a political opening. And one of the main reasons why was the deep corruption, economic and political corruption scandals from SQM, but also Albemarle. SQM had more of the direct corruption of the political system by financing political parties across the spectrum, enormous corruption that really affected the government of Bachelet and continued to reverberate throughout Piñera, and was one of the types of examples of elite impunity that protesters had in mind when they took to the streets in 2019, right? So a very clear example of buying out of the political system, right? But then both Albemarle and SQM had numerous irregularities, infractions in royalty payments, tax payments, export quotas. I mean, the list is, I'm writing this part of my book right now, and it's like I have to summarize because the list is so long. And so you had what we might call corrupt or irregular dealings between state agencies, or maybe even more like just the lack of state capacity to monitor everything going on. And that is one reason why left progressive forces have pushed for nationalization, of course, which then raises its own pitfalls in terms of how are the resources and rent spent. And I'm not saying that eliminates the problem of corruption, but that itself is like why people are demanding nationalization, for among other reasons.
Well, to me, corruption is fought by transparency.
Yeah.
The more transparency, the better. The more transparency mechanism in place, the better. And to me, organized crime, of course, plays a role on governance, and which is why the state should provide security. Just figure out how to exploit lithium reservoirs if the state will not be able to provide security to the investors or to itself. I mean, at the end of the day, it's something that destabilizes more than benefits.
Martin, did you have something you want to say?
Yeah, no, because I was thinking of about what Thea said, and I come back to my statement, and yes, there have been problems, especially with prices of export prices in Argentina. That's one of the main, and that's corruption. That's a problem. I mean, usually firms try to sell, or they say they sell at lower prices than they actually do. So that's certainly a problem. But my point here is, I mean, Thea also said, well, the state lacks the capacity, monitoring capacity, fiscalization capacity. So the question here is why nationalization will, it's a good strategy to address these problems. Because if you lack the capacity even to regulate or to monitor, why would you be able to produce and do it in a sustainable way and respecting the human rights? That's another problem, because sometimes here nationalization is proposed as a strategy, for example, to overcome problems in the relation with indigenous communities. But the thing is that if you take an activity which is carried out by the state, the performance is not much better. I mean, it is not that the state respect the rights of indigenous communities much more than private firms. So the question in the end is how we conceive, for example, in this case, the rights of communities, and what are the governance mechanisms to integrate communities, to respect, to hear their voices. So it's not always, I don't say it's the same, but it's not, I don't think the problem it's just solved by changing the ownership of the exploitation of the resources.
So next you have two questions from Melanie Brusseler, kind of long, so I'm going to try to summarize them. We talked at the beginning about the difference between like the original early 20th century wave of sort of like hard nationalizations versus the more contemporary mode that we're seeing, where there's more joint ventures. Melanie asks if there's still potential for sort of public ownership beyond the nation state in this sector, if there could be a sort of like Chilean Meidner plan, or she asks, or alternatively, could the partial financialization of state ownership be a compromise to raise capital and grow social wealth in the context of a lack of transfers from the global north? So yeah, I mean, can we talk about what opportunities there are to use this new sector to create social wealth, even if it's not, the kind of full-on nationalization of entire industries that we would have seen, in the 20th century?
Well, I'll start with Chile, and we can go to the other countries as well. But Chile just the Constitutional Convention wrote a new constitution. It's now being in this editing kind of phase. In September 4th or something like that, it will go for a public referendum. So we will see what happens. I hope it's approved. But it's there's a lot of high stakes political decision. But if it's approved. Excuse me, if it's approved, there are a bunch of new constitutional provisions that potentially affect how resources are defined, how ownership is defined, who has a kind of claim to resources or to how they are governed. And that will be worked out, everywhere from in social environmental conflicts on the ground to the legislature, to the courts. I mean, we've seen in Latin America a really diverse way that resources are governed, meaning it's not just what the executive says, it's not just what legislature says, but courts have had a big role. For example, in Latin America, in adjudicating competing claims to resource use and whatnot. So that, just to kind of keep that multiplicity of kind of veto points, but also deliberation points in mind. So now, we have a constitution that recognizes that, for example, just to put one example out there, that the human and environmental use of water comes above extractive uses. What do you do with two mining sectors, copper and lithium, that in their own ways are very water intensive, right? So, and they also set out a new water agency and also new levels of water governance, right? So that rural communities, indigenous communities are governing their water. That itself, if we just look through the lens of water, opens up a situation in which there's institutions that bring to the table extractive firms like local communities, the state, et cetera, in order to figure out what to do with just water use, which is existential for the copper industry and existential for the lithium industry. So I'm not directly answering the question. I more want to show that, because I don't think there's yet a direct answer, a simple answer, that the amount of the way that communities and local indigenous territories and communities, but also non-indigenous, are being empowered by new rights, and the way that the state is saying this is how we're going to prioritize, for example, water use, I think opens up the possibility of new forms of governance, and that it's really uncharted territory. But communities have these rights behind them, rights of nature, to go to the courts and say this is not being respected. And we know from Ecuador that Latin American courts actually, and Colombia, Latin American courts have been the leading edge of some progressive jurisprudence and actually recognizing these rights over extractive firms, over governments. So again, it's not a direct answer, but I think there are new tools on the table to sort of in a kind of bricolage patchwork way, create new forms of governance. That's me being optimistic again. But I'll turn it over to panelists if there's other ideas on this front.
I cannot add anything to your.
I just want to add something. I just want add. Melanie was asking about this subsidization or subsidized, and to me, it's like a loophole, in terms of fiscal terms, because at the end of the day, if you are subsidizing something that will not be self-sustainable, I believe that we must, think about how this business model will work to all, because using taxes and then reducing taxes seems to me that is not sustainable, and we can ask that to our fellows in Europe. They're missing with this natural gas because this Russian, sanctions and, power prices are skyrocketing. So we need to figure out a different way to handle this.
And then skip down to Nico Luciani asked a question that actually I had on our list. Can you, that I didn't get to, but what are the prospects for a regional cooperation? Obviously there's been talk of a lithium OPEC in the Southern Cone, but I'm curious, how you evaluate, how realistic is that?
I feel like we could have a whole event on how realistic that is, because it's actually very interesting. Even though it's very speculative, I like the comparison to the origins of OPEC and thinking through like what's similar and what's different. Mainly it's different, right? So mainly I don't, that's the TLDR, that's like the short version. But, let me just say what's similar really quickly, what's different, and then let's go to everyone because I'm very curious what other people have to say. Like, you have the shared resource, you have center left to left wing governments, so you have some basic political alignment. When Piñera was in power, for example, or when you had like an interim right wing government in Bolivia, this was not even a question on the table. You have like center left to left, so there's been these two, I think, thus far conversations between mining ministers and energy ministers from these countries. So you have. And interestingly, CEPAL, the classic institution to help with Latin American, ECLAC/CEPAL, however you say it in English or Spanish, has been hosting these meetings between ministers. So that's interesting to me. But then the similarities kind of end, or one other similarity, they all say they want to do value added development. Okay, we already talked about the challenges there. And they all have an interest in price, in making sure that prices stay high or at least are not super volatile. So that's where OPEC enters in to potentially, an OPEC type body to have some reduce the volatility around lithium prices. But I think, as I said, the similarities end there because, and I'll just lay out a couple and then we'll go to the others. Like, unlike the classic OPEC situation, you don't have countries where like large portions of their budget are made up by lithium, right? You don't have countries dealing with the same set of companies. Back in the day, it was the Seven Sisters, the 7 major oil companies. They all, treated the Middle East producers the same. And so the Middle East producers had the same grievances and the same circumstances and wanted to change them. I'm downplaying all the internal conflict, but basically like they wanted the same thing and they dealt with the same thing, right? Now you have, in Argentina, it's governed subnationally. In Chile, it's national with a lot of barriers to entry. In Bolivia and in Mexico, it's barely begun. You have this huge range. And so I think that makes coordination difficult, even if some of the politics are there for coordination because of the left-wing governments in power for now.
I agree completely with Thea. I mean, 10 years ago, this question about the OPEC of lithium was a big discussion. At the time, probably Argentina and Chile explained more than 50% of production. Now they explain less than 40%. So that's a big difference with the OPEC back in the 70s, which, if I'm not wrong, controlled more than 80% of oil production. So what we have is the resources, but we do not control production. The other thing is that, as Thea said, I think obviously now the governments are more aligned in political terms, but I think it's that like the big views. But in terms of the lithium strategy, I think the many difference that persists. I mean, no government in Argentina would put at risk the development of the lithium industry as it is now, controlled by private firms, to build a regional market. It would be like an extreme case, very unlikely from my perspective. However, but beyond the conditions, my question is always, what do you want with this PEC? I mean, what problem might it solve? So I think that it is probably to address the problems that the region, the common problems the countries of the region face in regards to the lithium industry without constructing a cartel. So you have, for example, environmental challenges. So you have to develop new technologies for lithium production. You don't need a cartel, you need scientific cooperation, and you need to try to cooperate, coordinate, to impose to the private sector the development of new technologies. So you need regulation, scientific cooperation. Other problem, the problem of standards. In the near future, Europe, the US, and maybe even China will demand for lithium production to be carried out with new standards. Will we expect third parties to impose their own standards, or we want to develop our own standards and negotiate the standards with third parties. In that case, if we control 40% of production and we say, well, the production standards is this one in terms of environment, relation with society, I think it's a good point. And the other thing is the question of price. The three countries have different approaches. Well, in particular, Chile and Argentina, which currently produce lithium compounds, they have like different strategies. I think Argentina has much to learn from Chile. Even though Chile has a lot of problems with price exports as well. So I think there is much field for cooperation beyond the question of the OPEP, which in the end, in my view, is a strategy to improve the capacity of the state to capture the economic rent. I think there are many other strategies beyond this cartelization of production.
Well, indeed, President López Obrador has asked to the Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard to seek cooperation with Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. But again, it all depends on supply and demand dynamics, as well as water and environmental footprints. You know, we need to focus on that. I mean, what would be the footprints of this new exploitation? And talking about quotas, I'm not a big fan, honestly. I mean, you know, I do understand why we should impose quotas, but it seems to me that it cannot be compatible in terms of trading, you know, especially if you're an open country. Yeah.
And then I think we'll end with this question from Nathan. Thea, you said the anti-extractivist groups have become less anti-state and more oriented towards participation with the state in various ways. Could you and the others speak more about how these anti-extractivist groups aim to attain more autonomy and communal control in the face of competitive pressures that these states face in the global market?
Yeah, and you know, I'm simplifying a lot here, and I'm aware that we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to continue to simplify because I don't have time for we don't have time for granular detail. But I'll give a sense of what I meant by that briefly, and then if folks have stuff to add. So you know, I don't per se mean that in the past anti-extractive groups were anarchist in the classical sense. In fact, what was interesting, and I don't actually know if this is the case elsewhere, but in Ecuador for sure, there a lot of anti-extractive leaders ran for public office. And so they occupied levels of government, mayor, city councilor, you know, province, whatever. And but what I mean more is that they were skeptical that expanding the state's authority over resources would further their goals of environmental protection and the recognition of indigenous rights. Not that they didn't engage with the state at all, right? They did in various means, including electoral. But now I've seen a little bit of a shift, and a lot of this is colored by my recent trip to Chile. So you can take that with a grain of salt, where, by the way, this conflict was never as intense as in Ecuador, right? So you already are starting from a different place. But I did see in the Constitutional Convention especially, but also within the ministries of Boric's government and in the social movements and civil society, in all of those three places, I saw more discussion of how public ownership in the broad sense that we discussed earlier is like a sine qua non of reducing environmental harm. Like, we don't trust the multinational companies to do it. This goes back to Martine's question of like, well, why would you expect the state to be better? If the issue is a regulatory shortfall, shouldn't we beef up the regulations more than include the state, right? So, I mean, these are questions that we can talk about, but that's the shift that I have noticed, is like a broadening of what ownership means, and also like in some cases in Chile, direct participation in the left project, and in Colombia. Let's not forget about Colombia, where I'll end it here. Petro and Francia are the first anti-extractive people coming to power for president and vice president. Like, I don't know, people watch Petro's speech when he accepted his victory, like a very thorough critique of extractivism. He wants to create an anti-fossil fuel alliance in the Americas. We'll see if AMLO wants to join that or not. He wants to really transition away from extractive sectors in Colombia, which we may forget is has a major oil and mining sector. So that's like an interesting twist as well, looking forward.
You know what? To me, it seems to me that it would be a good idea if we follow international standards such as social license, social impact license. Perhaps we should, be more focused on that and I don't know, going deep on that, because we need to use, different way of dialogue with communities and with I don't know, society. I mean, at the end of the day, we need to set a connection with society and to spread these social benefits. And to me, one of these tools that are being used on oil and gas industry, and the oil and gas industry should be used also in the lithium industry, and social impact license, it could be a good idea, as well as to follow all the standards of indigenous consultancy. If we follow that, then in a strict way and in a, in a strong way, not just for complying. I mean, in just not more paperwork. I'm talking about doing exactly the way it should be.
I can just only, I'm not a specialist in this particular field, but what I can say is that I feel the issue is now on the agenda, and that both sides are learning how to deal with it. I mean, communities for many years have pushed and demanded different treatment and to be listened. And I think firms now know that they have to do something with that. I'm not sure the answer companies are given to communities is the right one, and I'm not sure if they respect the social alliance and all the rights that communities have. But I think that in the future, this will be probably the most important issue the private sector and governments will have to deal with. I remember that I was in a conference, and there was a mining company said, well, our main challenge now is how to deal with the environmental and social question. Technology is like we'll solve it in some way, doesn't matter, but learning how to meet the demands, how to deal with society, I think it's relatively a new issue in the agenda. I mean, it was not 30 years ago, it was not an issue. I mean, things were solved in different ways, probably more violently. And so I think that now has emerged in a new way. But I repeat, I'm not a specialist. This is like my citizen view of the question.
All right. Well, I think we'll end there. I want to say thank you again to Miguel and Martin and Thea. That was a really great conversation. Really appreciate your expertise, and thank you so much to the attendees for coming and for giving us such great questions. And I hope for those of you who haven't already, please sign up for JFI's various email lists and newsletters. Synoja puts out a really great one for Phenomenal World. Yeah, thank you again for a great conversation.
Thank you.
That was great.
Welcome.
All right.